Hello again. We're going to be looking at value in this little video. The assignment for this exercise is to create a drawing using only value without using line at all, as much as you can avoid it anyway. Value, of course, has a special meaning for artists. It means a place on the grayscale between black and white. So these are a set of values. We call this a value scale. We could also make a gradient between black and white because there are infinitely many values. Value is really the way we see the world. Patches of value, of course, in normal life they have color, but in our drawings right now, since we're working with black and white media, our color is restricted to the grayscale. But those patches of dark and light, of value, are really the way we see the world around us. We don't see the world outlined with outlines, correct? Those are artificial boundaries that artists make between the edges of shapes in order to show where things are. They're a very nice shorthand, but there's another way to depict the world, and that's what we're going to be working on this exercise. So you see all the information that these patches of value give us here. We see a gradient for the sky. We see a form that's light against pale gray, and then light against very crisp black edge with no transition whatsoever. Then here we see a very, very soft value transition that tells us that this is a different kind of hill or grade in the landscape. We see this very, very clean, smooth gradient here that makes us feel that this sand dune is quite smooth. And then here we see this really cool repeated texture that shows us that light is being reflected back into our eyes very differently by the different curves of this surface. We can't show some of those things unless we get rid of line. And this is very challenging often for artists when they're first starting out because we are so used to outlining shapes. But I just love to have you look at this beautiful piece. It's by Martha Alf. It's done in graphite, which means in pencil. And although this may be powdered graphite, which can be put on with a brush as well. But you'll notice the different kind of edges here and all the information that these give us. So we see this pair, light against dark here, dark against light here, and there is just a whisper of a place here where the values actually blend together and there's really no value contrast at all. But we can easily make out that edge. We see this little pool of shadow underneath the pear and the softness of it compared to the relative crispness. We see this little bit of shadow that the one pear is casting on another as they just roll up against each other. We see the tiny bit of reflected light along this edge that distinguishes it from the background. And look at this, maybe a window, I think, in the background here, how beautifully it's drawn with these very, very soft transitions from light to dark to light to a little bit darker to a little bit darker yet, full of information. This part of the drawing seems like it's way further away, doesn't it, than this part of the drawing here. So you can't do all that stuff if you outline your shapes. So we're going to start right in learning how to draw without outlines. But again, this is not the way to draw. It's just a tool. The intention is to stretch your skills. Here's Seurat, a very famous pointillist, French painter from the late 1800s. This is a study drawing that he did. Pointillist means that he worked with tiny little points or dots of paint. And you'll see his painting in a moment. But first I'd like you to see in this drawing, it's very much like the pears, right? The only place where you could really maybe see an outline is maybe that's an outline around the nose area there. But pretty much everything else we see is a patch of value against another. Dark against light, or light against dark, or there might be places where the values just blend together, but we can see the form quite clearly. And when you see the model reversed here, of course, in the center in this painting, you realize that the same effect is really what Seurat was after in his paintings, and he was drawing on that heavily toothed paper in order to get that effect of the tiny little dots and the brushstrokes that enliven his work. There's a lot of information in shadows, both cast shadows and modeled shadows. Cast shadows, of course, are the ones that we see on the ground and the objects around our shadow caster, and modeled shadows are the shadows that we see on the form itself, like this one here. So shadows tell us the direction and the angle and the distance from the light. They tell us the shape of the object that's casting the shadow. And they also tell us the shape of the ground or the other objects that the shadow is lying upon. Think about that rippled sand dune that you saw a few minutes ago. Those shadows from the little ridges are giving us that information about the texture of the sand dune. Shadows are typically darkest right where they are underneath an object, and if that object doesn't quite touch the ground, there'll be a very dark pool of shadow under it. Shadows get softer as they go away from the object that's casting them, because remember, the object is protecting that surface from the light, and it's the light around begins to seep in and soften the edges of the shadow as you get further away. In the model shadow on a curved surface, the darkest part, or the core of the shadow, is not, as you might expect, next to the ground, but a little bit further up, about halfway up the shadowed area. There is a secondary highlight, or a little bit of reflection, that comes up from the surface that lights the bottom of the shadow, typically, when an object is round. But let's look at that in a beautiful painting, this Pontormo, instead of a dumb old diagram. So if you look very carefully at the volumes here, so look, say, under this young lady's chin, you'll see a little bit of reflected light coming up from below, so that the darkest part of her chin is not the bottom. If you look at this lady's nostrils here, right under her nose, you'll see light being reflected up from the shadows. You'll see it again here under this saint's chin, under Mary's eyebrows, underneath the edge of the hand here, a little bit of reflected light, really adding to that feeling of volume that the cast shadow gives us there. Very beautiful. You're going to be creating a drawing entirely without lines for this exercise, and I'm going to encourage you to start the same way that you started those gesture drawings. I started with Vine Charcoal on this demo here, and you can see very, very vigorous strokes, keeping it soft so that it can easily be changed. Just putting a little bit of time into going all over the page, giving your energy to the whole thing, incorporating the whole rectangle into your drawing. Even if you don't fill it with stuff, you know what its place is going to be in your composition. This is the second stage of the drawing, and here the objects are beginning to form. I've got two fairly complex objects, two skulls. You may not have skulls lying around your house to put into a still life, and you certainly don't need anything like that. But this is simply a white ball. So if you've got anything in between, light objects probably are a little bit easier to do this with, and it may be easier to see your shadows if you have a light surface that you can put them on. So a light colored table, or just lay down a piece of paper underneath your objects. You'll want a little bit of ambient light. I've just got the lights from the studio here, and you see that there's light shadows being cast on the right side here, dark shadows being cast underneath and to the left. A little bit of a confusing light situation. You may find that it's easier to do this if you do it next to a window, so you have a strong light source from one side. In this third stage of the drawing, I'm really starting to sharpen up the edges. And again, I struggled very conscientiously to do this for you without any outlines. There are some places now here where there were very, very skinny shapes of shadow that you could see down inside in between these plates of bone in the skull. But these edges here are all drawn by showing a dark value on one side and a lighter value on the other side. The drawing is starting to kind of firm up here at this point. And in this, I think this is the last one, yes. You'll see the major change here is that some of the edges are getting a little bit sharper. I've committed myself in some places where I really want it to be clear exactly where the edges are and how dark things get down in there. So if you go back to the last one, you can see, for example, that that ball is still a little bit cotton candy looking, and the value range is not quite as steep. The dark values in this one were added at the end with compressed charcoal. Again, that's very, very fun to use. Do be careful that you know where you want it when you finally go to use it. I did use a charcoal pencil on this. Be very careful when you get that pencil out to darken your important darks that you don't begin to accidentally start to outline things, because it is kind of hard to break that habit the first time you try it. I hope you'll enjoy this. I trust that it will be a challenge for most of you, for many of you, I think, but I know that you're ready for it, and I'm very, very excited to see what you'll do. Have fun.